It was an ordinary Thursday, the kind that fades into memory, mid-April, overcast but warm with a light breeze. Melissa Grant had left the house around 1:40 p.m. according to the timestamp on her security system. She buckled her 11-month-old son, Jacob, into his rear-facing car seat, loaded up the diaper bag, and texted her sister, "Just grabbing milk and fruit, be home by 3." That was the last message she ever sent. She pulled into the Evergreen Grocers parking lot at 2:07 p.m. Security footage shows her stepping out of the car, straightening her cardigan, and peeking into the back seat before locking eyes with a woman across the row who would later recall Melissa's faint smile. She walked briskly toward the sliding doors, one arm swinging freely, the other balancing her purse and reusable bags. Inside, Melissa was efficient. Receipts later confirmed she purchased 6 items: bananas, organic milk, a small pack of diapers, baby wipes, and 2 yogurts. Nothing about her behavior stood out. No signs of anxiety, no one trailing her. One aisle camera captured her reading the label on a jar of baby food, then putting it back. The cashier remembered her clearly, said she laughed when Jacob tried to grab the credit card machine, even though the baby was never seen on any footage. By 2:34 p.m., Melissa exited the store. The timestamp matched the parking lot camera angle that captured her walking back to her car. She loaded her groceries into the trunk, then circled to the back seat, presumably to check on or adjust Jacob. But she never reappeared. The footage freezes at 2:36:07 as a red pickup truck moves through the top of the frame, briefly blocking the view of her vehicle. When the truck passes, Melissa is gone. There's no struggle, no sound, no visible break in pace. The passenger side door never opens. She simply disappears behind her own car and never steps forward again. That was the moment that broke the town. By 5 p.m., Kevin Grant had called the police. He'd come home to an empty house, tried calling his wife 4 times, then driven the route to Evergreen Grocers himself. Her car was still parked 2 rows from the front, just beneath a broken security light. The driver's door was unlocked. Melissa's purse sat on the passenger seat, unzipped. Her keys were still in the ignition. A half-melted yogurt had leaked onto the floor mat, but the car seat and Jacob were missing. It was as if someone had surgically removed them from the vehicle and left everything else undisturbed. Within the hour, Westfield PD declared it a priority missing persons case. Officers cordoned off the parking lot, rerouted foot traffic, and began reviewing the tapes frame by frame. By nightfall, the grocery store was swarmed with local news vans. A statewide Amber Alert was issued just after midnight. Helicopters circled the surrounding neighborhoods. Door-to-door interviews began within a 3-mile radius. Kevin was brought in for questioning, though no evidence pointed toward him. His phone location, co-workers, and time card placed him at his office across town the entire afternoon. Investigators canvassed every registered red pickup in the county, nearly 1,100 of them, looking for any sign of the vehicle in the footage. They ran plate recognition software, interviewed delivery drivers, landscapers, and contractors. No one could identify the truck. No one recognized the make or model with certainty. The frame caught only a brief angle, no license plate, just a blur of red moving through the edge of tragedy. By the second day, search teams expanded to nearby woods, dumpsters, drainage ditches, and abandoned buildings. Sniffer dogs tracked Melissa's scent from the store entrance to her vehicle, and then nothing. No trail away. It was as if she'd stepped off the earth. Detectives struggled with what they weren't seeing. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass, no dragging marks, no struggle caught on tape, just a clean, silent vanishing. At the first press conference, the police chief was honest. "We have more questions than answers." Melissa's family appeared beside him, her mother pale and stiff, Kevin holding up Jacob's baby shoes, his voice cracking as he begged whoever had them to bring his family home. The town responded immediately. Flyers went up in every window. Volunteers printed T-shirts with Melissa and Jacob's photos. Local businesses donated to a reward fund, but the leads never gained traction. And the days stretched. For weeks, Melissa's face was everywhere. Milk cartons, billboards, social media feeds. But no trace of her or Jacob surfaced, not in hospitals, not in highway cameras, not in roadside motels. The red truck never appeared again. It was as though someone had taken a scalpel to the footage of that day and excised 2 lives from it with surgical precision. And yet, what haunted everyone wasn't what the footage showed. It was what it didn't. Because behind every frozen frame of that afternoon, one question loomed larger than the rest. How do a mother and her baby vanish in broad daylight in a crowded parking lot with cameras rolling? 14 years later, they would finally get an answer. But it wouldn't come from the footage. It would come from something else entirely, a car seat no one expected to see again. It was the 3rd day after Melissa and Jacob disappeared when the first witness came forward. Her name was Cheryl Delano, 64, a retired school nurse who'd parked 3 spaces down from Melissa's car the day it happened. She hadn't thought much of what she'd seen at the time, not until she recognized Melissa's face on the evening news. What she remembered wasn't dramatic. No screams, no struggle, just something off. She recalled a man, mid to late 30s, medium build, short dark hair, standing near the rear of Melissa's car. He was holding a baby. She assumed he was the father until she noticed Melissa seemed hesitant, almost reluctant. The man had one hand on the baby's back, the other lightly guiding Melissa by the elbow. Cheryl had turned to answer a phone call and didn't think of it again until later that night. Detectives took her statement seriously. She was coherent, consistent, and gave precise details. She described the man's clothing clearly: a dark blue shirt with a patch on the chest like a mechanic's uniform, dark pants, and work boots. She said he moved with familiarity, but Melissa's body language didn't match. She didn't look scared, Cheryl said, but she didn't look okay either. The most disturbing detail came at the end of her statement. She remembered that the man carried the baby to the red truck while Melissa followed several steps behind, not saying a word. Composite artists worked quickly, producing a sketch based on Cheryl's description. It showed a generic face, plain, symmetrical, forgettable. But the detail that stood out was the uniform. The blue mechanic's shirt became the focus of the manhunt. Flyers with the sketch went public within 24 hours. Tip lines lit up. Dozens of callers swore they'd seen someone like him. At gas stations, in diners, in auto shops across state lines. Most tips dead-ended within hours. One woman insisted he resembled a man who'd done maintenance work at her apartment complex 3 years ago, but the name she provided had no ties to the case. A local gas station attendant claimed to have seen a similar man asking for directions to County Road 19 the week before, but no surveillance footage backed it up. A young couple reported seeing a red pickup parked on the side of a service road with a man crouched beside it, holding something in a blanket, but that sighting was logged days before the abduction. Meanwhile, the pressure on Melissa's husband intensified. Kevin Grant maintained his innocence from the start, but in cases like this, the spouse is always scrutinized. Detectives ran his phone records, tracked his bank activity, and requested GPS logs from his office security system. Kevin voluntarily handed over his laptop, work phone, and access to his email. He allowed a search of their home without a warrant. Surveillance from his workplace placed him at his desk from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. on the day of Melissa's disappearance, corroborated by multiple co-workers and time-stamped video from 2 security angles. The only break in routine was a 6-minute window where he walked outside to his car to retrieve a USB drive. During that time, his car never left the lot. Investigators had no evidence to detain him, but online suspicion remained relentless. Kevin's emotional state began to fracture under the spotlight. He rarely left the house, grew combative with reporters, and appeared disoriented in interviews. But grief doesn't always look palatable. As the days passed, detectives began shifting focus away from the domestic angle and back to the scene of the crime. They revisited the forensic sweep of Melissa's car. Again, nothing conclusive, no prints beyond her own, no blood, no hair fibers. The only thing confirmed missing from the vehicle, the car seat, the diaper bag, and the compact stroller that always stayed in the trunk. None of those items were found discarded nearby. It suggested a level of planning. A random attacker would have left something behind, made a mistake. But this was clean. A retired detective named Walter Vaughn, who had served 30 years on the force before retiring in 2007, was quietly consulted by one of the younger officers working the case. After reviewing what little evidence they had, his response was blunt. This wasn't impulsive. It was prepared. He knew how long she'd be inside. He knew how to make her move without noise. When asked what that meant, Vaughn said, "It's not about force. It's about familiarity, or perceived familiarity." He made her believe she had to go. That's the part people miss. This theory gained traction when detectives reviewed Melissa's weekly routine. She'd gone to Evergreen Grocers every Thursday around the same time for nearly 3 months. Same store, same aisle pattern. It meant whoever took her may have been watching, not following her, watching the store, watching the patterns. It raised the possibility that the man in the mechanic's shirt wasn't a stranger at all, at least not to the location, and maybe not to Melissa. But even with the composite sketch, the red truck, and Cheryl's eyewitness account, the case remained stalled. It wasn't enough. The leads faded, the media coverage dwindled, flyers curled at the edges and fell from bulletin boards. But in the minds of the investigators who stayed on it, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't a snatch and run. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was surgical, rehearsed, and deliberate. And the man in the mechanic's shirt didn't just take Melissa and Jacob. He took time. He took silence. And he left nothing behind, at least not yet. The red pickup truck captured in the corner of the surveillance frame became the cornerstone of the investigation. It was the only vehicle unaccounted for that passed by Melissa's car in the exact moment she vanished. Detectives worked through every registered red pickup in the Tri-County area, narrowing the list by color match, year, wheelbase, and trim, until they reached one particular vehicle, a 1998 Dodge Ram owned by a man named Curtis Harlan. Curtis had worked at Bell's Auto Service in town for nearly 6 years, but had quit abruptly and left the state just 2 days after Melissa and Jacob disappeared. No forwarding address, no explanation. Just gone. It took almost a week for investigators to track him down. He'd moved to Traverse City, Michigan, where he was living in a rented house, trailer behind a bait shop, paid under the table for basic handyman work. When detectives finally made contact, Curtis didn't resist questioning. He said he'd already been expecting them. He claimed he sold the truck on the Monday after the disappearance, said he was planning to move anyway, and didn't want to drag the damn thing across 2 states. But when investigators pulled the transaction record, the name listed for the buyer was fake. A dead end. No valid ID, no verifiable address. Just a hastily scrawled signature on the title transfer form, Donnie King. When pressed, Curtis remained calm. He didn't deny being at Evergreen Grocers on the day Melissa vanished. In fact, he admitted it outright, said he was there picking up cough syrup for his girlfriend, said he saw the lady from the news coming out with a bag of groceries. She had a tired look, he told them, didn't look like she wanted to be there. When asked if he interacted with her, he said no. When asked if he saw anyone with her, he said he didn't remember. His story didn't waver. His alibi, though shaky, had some corroboration. His ex-girlfriend confirmed the store trip, though not the exact time. Curtis agreed to take a polygraph. He passed, but a past polygraph wasn't enough to clear him in the eyes of the town. The sale of the truck under a fake name raised flags. His abrupt departure raised more. He had no prior criminal record, no complaints of violence, nothing documented. But something about the timing felt wrong. Investigators searched his Michigan trailer. They found nothing. No baby items, no photos, no signs of Melissa or Jacob. But suspicion lingered, and online it turned into fuel. On forums dedicated to the case, Curtis Harlan's name became shorthand for guilt. Anonymous users dissected his photos, calling out the shadow in his eyes. Old classmates came forward with stories of his bad temper, claiming he was weird around moms. One woman said he stared at her in line at a hardware store once and made her uncomfortable. None of it rose to the level of evidence, but in the court of public opinion, it didn't have to. Melissa's family stayed mostly quiet through that year. Her sister Rachel made one appearance on a local radio show, thanking the community for support, but pleading with them not to chase theories without proof. "We want answers," she said, "but not at the cost of truth." Kevin, already distant from the media, refused interviews altogether. He focused on raising awareness, organizing yearly search events, and helping design a small memorial page for Melissa and Jacob. But even as he worked behind the scenes, the grief calcified. The absence never loosened its grip. Every May, the family held a candlelight vigil in the Evergreen Grocer's parking lot. Dozens came each year: neighbors, classmates, former co-workers, strangers who remembered. They stood in silence beside a temporary memorial of framed photos and stuffed animals. Some years it rained, some years the candles blew out early, but they always lit them again. At the center of the memorial, always, was a photo of Melissa holding Jacob at his 6-month checkup, his hands clutching her braid, both of them smiling, unaware of what was coming. Investigators, though quieter, never completely let go. The red truck was still out there, somewhere, maybe repainted, maybe stripped, maybe crushed. They continued to re-interview witnesses, chasing new leads as they surfaced. One tip claimed Curtis had driven out past state lines toward a rural grain silo just days after the disappearance, but no sign of tire tracks or disturbances could be verified. Another claimed he was seen burning something behind his Michigan trailer, but soil tests came back clean. With no physical evidence, no witnesses placing him near Melissa's vehicle, and no forensic ties to the scene, Curtis Harlan was never charged. And yet his name remained synonymous with the case. He stayed in Michigan, kept a low profile, worked odd jobs, moved twice more. Each time, his address was quietly noted in the background of the cold case file. Nothing linked him directly, but nothing ever ruled him out either. And for the families left waiting, silence didn't sound like closure. It sounded like hiding. It was late spring of 2014 when the manager of a self-storage facility outside Dayton, Ohio, called the police over something that felt wrong. The unit had been flagged for auction after months of unpaid rent. It wasn't unusual. They cleared out dozens of abandoned lockers every year. But when a new staffer opened this one, he stopped cold. Against the back wall sat a single medium-sized box, sealed with heavy-duty packing tape and marked in faded black marker. "Baby supplies. Do not open." Inside was a smell, damp cloth and mildew. Not decay, but not far from it. When the responding officers arrived, they took one look at the contents and contacted Westfield PD in Indiana. The storage unit hadn't been opened since the previous year, but what was inside brought everything back. Wrapped in a deteriorating plastic bag was a pale yellow baby blanket with a stitched blue elephant on the corner, an exact match to one seen in photos of Jacob Grant's nursery. Next to it, a mold-flecked diaper bag containing unused formula packets, a baby spoon, and a pacifier with faint teeth marks on the side. And at the bottom, a jar of coffee. The label nearly gone, but legible enough to identify the brand. It was a boutique French roast Melissa had always ordered online, something she treated herself to after having Jacob, something her sister Rachel immediately recognized when shown the photo. "That was hers," she said. No question. There was no note, no photos, no medical records, no IDS, just objects, familiar ones, but none of them offered answers on their own. The storage unit itself had been registered under the name Susan Maynard, a name not linked to any real person in the state or surrounding region. The phone number used to reserve the unit traced back to a burner that had been deactivated 2 years earlier. Payment records showed that the rent had been paid in cash every 6 months, on time, until it suddenly stopped. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from the facility's archived DVR system, but most of the tapes had degraded past usability. One partial clip from 2010 showed a woman, or possibly a man, in a heavy coat and baseball cap unloading boxes from a sedan. The camera resolution was too low to make out facial features. Even enhancement tools couldn't extract anything usable. The license plate was blocked by a storage pillar. The figure moved with care. Deliberate, slow. As if the box they were placing wasn't just fragile, but important. The discovery changed the case. For the first time, it gave weight to something long whispered in quiet spaces online and in the family's private moments, that Melissa and Jacob might have survived the initial abduction, that they were somewhere, that they had been alive together, at least for a while. The diaper bag was tested for DNA, but years of heat and moisture had erased almost everything. The few fibers they pulled were inconclusive. No prints, no hair, no blood, nothing forensic. But the emotional impact was immediate. Rachel Grant broke down when detectives showed her the photos of the blanket. She remembered the night Melissa brought it home, remembered how she joked that Jacob loved it more than me. Kevin, now visibly older and quieter, looked at the items with a blank expression, only saying, "She didn't take that coffee anywhere. Not unless she was planning to stay." Investigators brought in a missing persons consultant, a former FBI profiler who reviewed the evidence and patterns. His conclusion was unsettling. "Someone went to careful lengths to keep them invisible," he said. "This wasn't chaos. This was structured, controlled. Someone knew how to keep people off the radar, especially a woman and a baby." The timeline became clearer. If Melissa was alive when the storage unit was first rented, and there was strong circumstantial evidence to believe she was, it meant she and Jacob may have lived in hiding or captivity for at least a year after their disappearance. It raised dozens of new questions. Was she under someone's control? Had she been forced to leave her life behind? Had she ever left Indiana at all? Or had someone else transported the items across state lines after something happened to her? One theory suggested Melissa had escaped briefly, maybe even tried to start over before being found again. Others believed the storage unit was part of a larger plan, a drop-off site to remove any trace of her once she was no longer useful, a way to erase her quietly. But nothing was definitive, and without fingerprints or a trail, police couldn't tie the items to anyone specific. Still, something shifted in public consciousness. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was a case in motion, a case with new blood. Online forums reignited. True crime bloggers dissected the storage unit discovery for weeks. A podcast dedicated 3 full episodes to the box alone, comparing the layout of the items to case studies in controlled isolation, suggesting whoever kept Melissa may have done the same to others. For Westfield PD, the discovery was equal parts hope and horror. It meant they'd been close, maybe just one step behind, for years. That someone had driven from Indiana to Ohio with a baby blanket, a diaper bag, and a jar of coffee, and locked them away as if sealing off evidence of a life lived in secret. That someone wanted Melissa's story, and Jacob's, buried quietly in a concrete room with no windows and no witnesses. And yet, despite the silence, something had survived. A blanket, a spoon, a coffee jar, enough to say, they were here. And maybe, somewhere out there, something else was still waiting to be found. It started with a blurry gas station photo. A woman in oversized sunglasses, pale sweatshirt, pushing a shopping cart with a small child inside. The image was posted anonymously on a true crime forum in early 2016, captioned simply, "Could this be Melissa Grant?" The user claimed it had been taken the week prior in a rural part of Iowa, just outside Grinnell. Within hours, it went viral. The woman's posture, her hair, the slight curve of her jaw, they all bore a haunting resemblance to Melissa. And the child, maybe 3 years old, had sandy blonde hair and the same sharp cheeks that reminded many of Jacob. Westfield PD was notified by noon. By nightfall, a task force was en route. The house they raided belonged to a man in his 50s who claimed the woman was his niece, recently moved in after a separation. She answered the door barefoot, clutching the child to her chest. When detectives asked her name, she hesitated, just long enough to raise concern. She identified herself as Amanda Parker, said the child was her son, Micah. When asked for documentation, she claimed she'd lost it in the move. She didn't resist the request for DNA, Didn't argue, didn't cry. But something about her silence unsettled the lead investigator. There was a hollowness behind her eyes that made everyone wait just a little longer before breathing. 48 hours later, the results arrived. She wasn't Melissa. The boy wasn't Jacob. There was no biological match to the Grant family. Their fingerprints came back clean. Amanda Parker was her real name. She'd simply fled an abusive marriage and was hiding out with her son, afraid of being found. When the officers returned to formally clear her, she simply nodded and said, "I figured." The photos that had stirred a nation had caught a different kind of grief, one still alive. But the damage was already done. The media storm triggered by the false lead brought new scrutiny to Melissa's family, especially Kevin. Reporters began digging deeper into the years following the disappearance. Kevin had divorced quietly in 2012, citing irreconcilable differences, though the marriage had been dissolving long before. Friends described him as withdrawn, paranoid, and increasingly bitter. One neighbor claimed he hadn't decorated for holidays in 5 years. Another said she'd heard shouting through the walls on the night Melissa disappeared, though police had already dismissed that detail as unrelated. Then came the interviews. In a segment for a regional crime show, Kevin appeared disoriented, confused by dates, and contradicted earlier statements he'd made in 2009. He said Melissa had texted him, "I love you," before leaving for the store, a message no one could verify. He said Jacob had been sick that morning, but pediatric records showed a clean bill of health. Under pressure, Kevin admitted to an affair that had briefly occurred in the months before Melissa vanished. Her name was never disclosed, but phone records confirmed frequent communication with a woman in his office. When asked why he hadn't shared that earlier, Kevin said, "Because it didn't matter." She was gone either way. The admission fractured what remained of his public support. Online, the narrative shifted quickly. If he could lie about that, what else was he hiding? If he was capable of betrayal, was he capable of worse? New theories flourished, that Melissa had discovered the affair and fled with Jacob, that Kevin had staged the disappearance out of shame, that it was all orchestrated to cover something darker. But none of it matched the facts. Police revisited his original alibi. His time card from work still held. The security footage from his office still showed him seated at his desk for nearly the entire afternoon. His phone never left the building. His financials showed nothing suspicious, no withdrawals, no rentals, no gas purchases beyond his normal routine. The theory that Melissa had run away with Jacob was re-examined and ultimately discarded. She had taken nothing with her, no clothes, no IDs, no money. Her social security number hadn't been used in 7 years. Jacob's birth certificate had never resurfaced. She hadn't opened a new account, hadn't applied for benefits. No sightings had held up. No voice had ever called to say she was okay. Kevin's world shrank after that. He stopped returning calls from reporters. He skipped the next vigil. His house, once neatly maintained, began to fall into disrepair. He left the porch lights on day and night, something neighbors noticed but no one asked about. One morning, a local librarian found him sitting alone in the children's section, staring at a worn copy of Goodnight Moon for over an hour. When asked if he needed help, he simply shook his head. Whatever people believed about Kevin, he'd become a symbol of absence. Whether guilty or innocent, whether truthful or broken, he was still a man who had once held his son, once kissed his wife goodbye, and now lived in a silence that neither cleared him nor comforted him. The raid in Iowa had promised answers and left behind more questions. But beneath the public noise, investigators kept circling one fact. Melissa hadn't left alone. Someone took her. Someone kept her. And someone had hidden every trace of their lives for 5 years without making a single mistake. They just hadn't made their last one yet. It was late August 2023 when the Walcott River dropped to its lowest level in 17 years. A summer of relentless drought had cracked the lake beds, shrunk ponds into puddles, and exposed things the water was never meant to give back. On the east side of the old dam, where the river bends sharply through a shallow ravine, A hiker named Eli Mann stopped to photograph a sun-bleached log jammed between boulders. Just beyond it, tangled in a nest of driftwood and river debris, he spotted something pale and unnatural, a rounded shell, the faded shape of molded plastic, partially buried in silt. At first, he thought it was a piece of discarded furniture, but as he got closer, the outline came into focus. A baby car seat, thick with algae, straps stiff from exposure, and the entire frame wrapped tightly in a weathered layer of industrial-grade plastic. It had been sealed deliberately, not just tossed, preserved. The plastic was knotted in a way that suggested intention, like someone had tried to keep the elements out or something in. Eli reported it that same afternoon. By evening, a dive team had secured the area. Forensics handled the car seat with surgical care, removing the layers of plastic like opening a time capsule. The serial number etched along the frame was still faintly visible. It matched a Graco Snug Ride model purchased in early 2008. Melissa Grant's online baby registry confirmed it. Photos from Jacob's nursery showed the exact same seat, down to the faint turtle decal on the side cushion. There was no doubt. After 14 years, Jacob's car seat had surfaced. Inside, the fabric was waterlogged, darkened by age and sediment. No bones, no remains. But lab analysis confirmed degraded traces of human DNA embedded deep in the foam lining. Too broken down for a full profile, but enough to classify as infant. The results were consistent with someone under 2 years old, most likely Jacob. The discovery hit the community like a fault line. Within days, media trucks returned to Westfield. The Grant case, long cold, was reopened with renewed urgency. The items from the Ohio storage unit suddenly looked like breadcrumbs, scattered but deliberate, and now a car seat sealed in plastic and buried by time had pulled the case back into daylight. Investigators focused on the plastic itself. It wasn't common household wrap. It was high-density polyethylene, the kind used in industrial shipping. The texture, weight, and imprint markers led them to a specific source: Barlow Packaging, a facility just 28 miles from the original crime scene. At the time of Melissa's disappearance, Barlow specialized in industrial-grade wrapping used for large equipment shipments. A former employee mentioned that back in 2009, they offered end-of-line rolls to workers to take home, sometimes as makeshift tarps or storage wrap. There was no sign-in or tracking, just verbal approval from floor managers. Detectives pored over employment logs from 2008 and 2009. The list included over 70 names. Most had moved on. Some were deceased. But one name jumped out immediately: Dale Forrester, a dock technician who had worked nights at Barlow and quit abruptly just 4 days after Melissa and Jacob vanished. For weeks, police had no explanation for how the car seat had ended up in the river. The terrain was remote, inaccessible by road, shielded by brush. The working theory was that it had been carried partway by vehicle, then dropped manually. But the plastic wrap was what kept it preserved and kept it hidden. If not for the drought, if not for one hiker's pause, it might have stayed sealed in the riverbed another 14 years. The Grant family was notified privately. Kevin didn't speak to reporters. Melissa's sister issued a short statement. "We never stopped believing they'd left a trail. We just didn't know where to look. And now, finally, they had a direction. Not a resolution, not yet, but a shift. Something real." What haunted the detectives most wasn't just the condition of the car seat. It was the care, the precision. Someone hadn't just thrown it into the river. They'd wrapped it, bound it, lowered it between rocks, and let nature swallow it. That wasn't panic. That wasn't desperation. That was planning. And it suggested whoever had taken Melissa and Jacob had done this before, or at least thought about it long enough to get it right the first time. In 14 years, not a single confirmed sighting had held up. Not a single piece of forensic evidence had survived. Until now. The car seat didn't just belong to Jacob. It told a story. Someone had kept him in that seat long enough to need it gone. Someone had handled him after the abduction. And someone had gone to great lengths to bury part of the evidence without leaving a fingerprint behind. The cold case was no longer cold. The trail that had vanished after a grocery store parking lot now bent toward a packaging facility, a name, and a method. Investigators didn't know it yet, but the next piece of the story, the most damning piece, would be hidden behind insulation in a house that no one had searched. Not yet. When the name Dale Forrester surfaced from the 2009 employee logs at Barlow Packaging, it didn't ring any bells. Not at first. But by the second pass through old records, investigators noticed something most had missed. Forrester had been on the late-night logistics crew, loading, wrapping, and shipping freight between midnight and 6 a.m. And more importantly, he'd worked temporary delivery routes during peak months, including the spring of 2009. One of those delivery routes passed within 2 blocks of Evergreen Grocers, where Melissa Grant and her infant son vanished. He quit the job 4 days after they disappeared. No notice, no explanation, just gone. A deeper background check turned up more. Forrester had a prior conviction for unlawful surveillance, a charge that, while non-violent, involved hidden cameras in women's dressing rooms back in the early 2000s. He'd served time, quietly re-entered the workforce, and slipped beneath the radar. He hadn't been named in the original investigation because he hadn't owned a red truck, and his name never came up in initial witness canvassing. But now, with the plastic wrap on Jacob's car seat traced back to Barlow, and Forrester's name on the facility's internal wrap access list, he jumped to the top of the suspect board. Detectives secured a search warrant for the property. Forrester had been living off-grid for the past several years in a crumbling farmhouse deep in rural Indiana, about an hour from Westfield. No utilities, no formal address, just a generator, well water, and a habit of keeping to himself. Neighbors, few and far between, described him as polite but strange. One recalled him stopping by every couple of weeks for canned goods and batteries, always paying in cash. When officers executed the warrant, Forrester didn't resist. He stood barefoot in the doorway, watched them in silence, and said only, "You won't find anything that matters." But in the shed behind his house, padlocked and buried under sheets of rusted tin, they found plenty. Inside were shelves of miscellaneous items, old radio parts, license plates, bolts, and containers of engine oil. But on the far wall hung a warped pegboard lined with personal effects, small, precise, deliberate. A baby's knitted booty, still pink, a pair of sunglasses with one cracked lens, a hospital wristband, a pacifier still attached to a plastic clip. The detectives didn't speak at first. They just started cataloging. Wrapped in a sealed bin beneath the workbench were what appeared to be maps, dozens of them, all hand-drawn. Some of local roads, others of storage facilities, alleyways, parks, abandoned homes. Most were marked with X's. Several had dates in the margins, between 2007 and 2012. It wasn't immediately clear what they were tracking, but near the bottom of the bin, they found something else. A stained piece of baby clothing. A one-piece, size 12 months, with the same cartoon turtle decal seen on Jacob's other belongings. Forrester claimed he found everything in a dumpster. Said it was years ago, didn't remember where. Said the baby clothes were leftovers from someone else's mess. But that story cracked when a partial fingerprint on the inside collar of the one-piece matched Melissa Grant. She had touched it, worn it, folded it, packed it. That was the moment the case shifted from circumstantial to direct. Forrester was taken into custody, but not on abduction or homicide charges, not yet. Instead, investigators booked him on unrelated possession counts after finding several unregistered firearm components in the shed. It was enough to hold him while they searched the rest of the property. He didn't speak. No anger, no protest, no panic, just silence. Then, inside the attic, behind a sheet of insulation in the far corner, investigators found a small compartment sealed with wood planks and nails, almost like a crawl space. It didn't smell. It wasn't large. But what was inside unraveled everything. Stacked in rows were VHS tapes, each labeled in faded marker with dates ranging from 2009 to 2011. Some were blank, some were labeled Room A or Playtime, or just with the word M. Alongside the tapes were more items: a folded journal with pages torn out, a child's spoon, and a cracked plastic picture frame. Inside it, a photo of Melissa taken after her disappearance. She looked older, thinner. She was holding Jacob, who appeared to be around 1 year old. The photo was real. The frame was covered in dust, and behind it, written on the back in faded pen, were the words, "They don't know where we are." Detectives froze. None of them spoke for nearly a full minute, because in that instant, the theory shifted again, from what might have happened to what definitely had. Melissa and Jacob had been alive after the disappearance, for at least a year, possibly longer, and whatever had kept them hidden hadn't been an accident, it had been orchestrated. The discovery of the tapes would require immediate forensic handling, and the image, that single photo, would become the first verified post-abduction sighting of both Melissa and Jacob Grant. 14 years too late. But finally, something concrete, something undeniable, and the man who kept it all sealed in insulation, inside a house no one had looked at twice in over a decade, was now in custody, refusing to say a word. The VHS tapes were carefully logged, bagged, and handed over to the digital forensics unit, where every inch of tape was digitized frame by frame. There were 4 in total, each labeled with a month and year: June 2010, August 2010, October 2010, December 2010. No labels beyond that. No case. Just the raw handwriting of someone who either wanted to document something or couldn't risk forgetting. What investigators saw on those tapes would shift the case and the emotional center of the story in a way no one was prepared for. The first tape opened with static. Then a dim room, yellowish lighting, one small lamp in the corner, a mattress on the floor. In the center sat a woman, barefoot, hair uneven and short, face lean but unmistakably Melissa Grant. She was cradling a toddler in her lap, whispering something too quiet to hear. She looked up at the camera, her expression calm but alert, and said clearly, "If you find this, we're okay." Or we were. Jacob looked older, around 18 months, healthy, alert. He clung to her as she rocked gently. She whispered a lullaby, then glanced toward the door just off frame and paused. Her tone didn't match the room. She spoke softly but with a thread of rehearsed control. "Jacob's doing well. We're safe right now. He's sleeping more, eating when we can. We don't go outside. Danny says it's better this way." That name, Danny. It surfaced again in the second tape. She repeated it several times, but always with uncertainty. Danny said the power might go out again. Danny brought food today. No milk. Danny fixed the lock. Never once did she mention Dale Forrester, the man now in custody. Not by name, not by nickname, not even by reference. All her words pointed to someone else, someone with access, someone present, someone she had no choice but to obey. By the third tape, things had shifted. Melissa's energy was different. Her face had fresh bruising along her right cheekbone. She moved slower. Her speech came in fragments. "We're okay," she repeated, but with a trembling breath. "We're getting tired." She pressed Jacob's hand to her lips and stared into the lens for over a minute without speaking. At one point, she reached up as if to turn the camera off, but didn't. Instead, she repositioned Jacob on her lap and began reciting names. "Rachel, Kevin, Mama," then stopped. "Danny said we'll be moved soon. I don't know where. He says it's for our safety." The fourth tape was the shortest, just under 5 minutes. Melissa looked gaunt. There was a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Jacob sat nearby on a thin rug, pushing a plastic block in slow circles. She glanced toward the door again, always the door, then looked back at the camera and whispered, "If anyone sees this, we didn't stop trying." "I don't think I'll be able to." The tape ended mid-sentence. No fade out, just static. Detectives paused the footage. No one spoke for a long time. For the Grant family, it was confirmation. Melissa had been alive. She had cared for Jacob. She had left behind proof. But the pain wasn't softened by the truth. It was sharpened. Her voice, after 14 years, was not a ghost. It was present, immediate, and filled with quiet desperation. Kevin reportedly left the station in silence, his face unreadable. Rachel Grant collapsed into tears after watching the second tape. "She was right there," she said. "She was still fighting." Investigators zeroed in on the name Danny. It was the only new lead, one they hadn't seen in any prior interviews, court records, or associated addresses. If Melissa had never named Dale, but repeatedly mentioned someone else, then Dale may not have acted alone, or even at all in the way they first assumed. They pulled visitor logs, employment overlaps, and phone records from Barlow Packaging. One match stood out: Daniel Forrester, Dale's younger brother. Never arrested, no record. He'd worked briefly as a temp at Barlow in the spring of 2009, same months Melissa had begun grocery shopping at Evergreen. Daniel left the job before his brother, but records showed he'd used Dale's truck at least twice for equipment runs. That truck, now long gone, had never been conclusively located. Further investigation showed Daniel had moved out of state in 2012. No forwarding address, no utilities in his name. A phantom, but not entirely. DMV databases showed a license renewal in Washington state, and from that, a faint but traceable trail began to form, one that would eventually lead to a quiet job listing, a bait-and-trap interview, and a cold arrest without incident. But all of that was still ahead. For now, there were just the tapes, 4 pieces of evidence that didn't just crack the case, they shattered it. Melissa had spoken, not to accuse, not to name names, but to leave a record. She had kept Jacob safe for as long as she could. She had survived long after the world had assumed her dead, and now, with her voice preserved in analog dust and tape hiss, she'd left the one name that mattered: Danny. And someone, somewhere, still had to answer for that name. The name Danny was the final thread, and when it was pulled, the entire hidden framework of the case unraveled. Investigators traced employment records, delivery manifests, and housing histories, and it didn't take long for Danny to be matched. Daniel Forrester, the younger brother of Dale. He had no criminal record, no arrest history, and no flagged behavior. On paper, he was invisible, but in the background of nearly every place Dale had worked or lived between 2007 and 2011, Daniel had been there. Sometimes officially, sometimes not. Daniel had worked briefly in delivery for Barlow Packaging before Dale did. He wasn't on the formal employee roster, but signed dispatch logs placed him behind the wheel on at least 4 occasions in early 2009. One of his regular routes included the shopping center where Evergreen Grocers stood, the same place Melissa visited every Thursday. He would have seen her, maybe even spoken to her in passing. He would have known her schedule, her habits, how long she spent inside, and when to strike. When police finally located Daniel in 2023, he was living under a different name, not illegally, just quietly. He'd relocated to a rural part of Alaska in 2012, working odd jobs, keeping to himself. No marriage, no kids, no close friends, just distance. That distance broke the moment the FBI posed as a recruitment agency offering a remote facilities technician position in Washington state. The bait was specific: high pay, under-the-table travel reimbursement, and work that involved remote properties with limited oversight. Daniel took it. He was arrested in the parking lot of a small municipal building outside Tacoma. No resistance, just confusion. In the interrogation room, they didn't start with questions, they started with the tapes. They played the second one in full. Daniel watched, eyes locked on the screen, hands motionless in his lap. When Melissa said his name, his posture collapsed. Not dramatically, just a slump, as if the tension had finally finished chewing through his spine. He didn't speak for nearly 10 minutes. Then, without being prompted, he confessed. He said it started as a plan, not his, but Dale's. A way to send a message after what he described as an argument between Dale and Melissa over something personal. He never clarified what. He claimed his brother just wanted to scare her for a few hours, to make her feel vulnerable. Dale waited until Melissa parked, then intercepted her in the lot, pretending something was wrong with her tire. Daniel followed in the red pickup, took the baby quietly. It was supposed to last an afternoon. But by nightfall, something shifted. Dale panicked. Daniel returned to find Melissa locked in the basement and Jacob asleep upstairs. Daniel didn't walk away. He stayed. The basement was modified, Daniel's word, with new bolts, insulation, and blackout curtains. Over time, it evolved into a room with books, a mattress, toys, even a battery-powered camera. Daniel claimed Melissa wasn't chained, but admitted she wasn't free. He brought her food, watched her bathe Jacob in a plastic bin, recorded her on VHS to prove she was okay. He said he cared about her, that he fell in love with her quiet. Investigators would later describe it differently. Obsession wrapped in the illusion of mercy. Jacob got sick during the winter of 2011, a severe fever. The power had gone out during a storm. The space heater failed. Daniel said he tried to find medicine, but by the time he returned, it was too late. Jacob died in his mother's arms. Melissa stopped eating after that, stopped speaking. She grew weaker by the week. Daniel said he begged her to hold on, but she refused. Eventually, she simply stopped waking up. He kept the bodies for days, unsure what to do. Dale returned briefly, furious and silent. Together, they dug a grave beneath an old structure on Dale's property, a workshop they tore down shortly after. They wrapped the bodies separately, buried them side by side. Daniel took the car seat, cleaned it, and sealed it in industrial plastic before placing it in the Walcott River. He said he didn't want it ending up in a landfill. When asked why he'd filmed Melissa, he said, "So someone would know she mattered." DNA pulled from the car seat matched Daniel, confirming the transfer. His story aligned with everything the tapes had hinted at: the isolation, the shifts in Melissa's tone, the growing fatigue, the references to Danny. He gave the burial site voluntarily. Cadaver dogs would later confirm human remains at the exact location he described. Melissa and Jacob had been there all along, beneath a building no one thought to check. A structure that hadn't existed for years. Daniel was charged with multiple counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, unlawful confinement of a minor, and 2 counts of homicide. He waived his right to trial, pleaded guilty, never asked for leniency. In the end, it wasn't surveillance footage or fingerprints that brought him down, or it was Melissa, her voice, her presence, her deliberate act of speaking into the lens, not knowing if anyone would ever hear her again, but doing it anyway. She said his name, and that name pulled him into the light. The case, for years marked by absence, silence, and dead ends, had finally found its answer. Not in a courtroom, not in a confession, but in a dim room, on a dusty tape, in the steady voice of a mother who had not given up, not until the very end. The excavation began quietly. No media, no public announcement, just a small, roped-off patch of earth where Dale Forrester's old workshop once stood, now nothing more than overgrown weeds and scattered cinder blocks. Beneath what used to be the south corner, ground-penetrating radar detected a distinct irregularity, shallow voids too uniform to be natural. It took less than a day for crews to reach what they'd hoped they wouldn't find. 2 burial sites, side by side, poured over with cement and covered in debris. The outlines of bodies were faint at first, but unmistakable. 1 adult, 1 child. By the time forensics confirmed the identities, the story had already returned to the headlines. Melissa Grant and her son Jacob, gone without a trace for 14 years, were now accounted for. Their lives had ended here, beneath concrete and silence, in a place where no one had thought to dig. There were no clothes left to recover, no keepsakes. But the bones told their own story, preserved just long enough to say they had been there, together, until the very end. DNA tests finalized what the confession had already made clear. Melissa and Jacob had been buried within days of one another. His remains showed signs of severe illness, most likely pneumonia, untreated and unmedicated. Melissa's bone scans indicated prolonged malnutrition. No clear signs of blunt trauma or wounds, just the slow fading of a woman who, after losing her child, stopped trying to survive for herself. Her ribs showed signs of stress fractures, the result of long-term starvation. She hadn't escaped, but she had resisted, quietly, completely. Daniel Forrester pled guilty in court without condition. There was no trial, no witness stand. Just a written statement submitted during sentencing in which he referred to the tapes as gifts I couldn't stop watching. He showed no emotion when the judge read the charges. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of unlawful confinement, and multiple federal violations related to concealment and destruction of evidence. He was sentenced to life without parole. No one from his family came to the hearing. Melissa's family, however, did. Kevin Grant, now visibly older and walking with a slight tremor, sat in the front row. Rachel Grant gave a brief statement outside the courthouse afterward. It was televised nationwide. She didn't speak long. She didn't run, Rachel said. She was trapped. And she tried to leave clues. We just didn't see them. The statement rippled through every community that had followed the case. For years, people had speculated, theorized, blamed. And now, the truth sat plainly in front of them, brutal, precise, and entirely preventable. In the weeks that followed, lawmakers in Indiana and surrounding states began drafting legislation aimed at closing the loopholes that had allowed Melissa and Jacob to vanish without trace. The proposed bill, informally named the Grant Act, included mandatory forensic review of abandoned storage units, forgotten car seats, and sealed containers discovered on public or private land. It also required storage facilities to log identities against state databases more stringently, flagging fake names for further inspection. It wouldn't bring them back, but it might stop another family from losing someone the same way. The Evergreen Grocer's parking lot, still open and operating, became the site of something else, a memorial, not requested, but insisted upon by the community. The town council approved a plaque near the front entrance, where Melissa had parked that day in 2009. It was installed in a simple concrete pedestal just below the broken security light that was never repaired. It read, "For Melissa and Jacob Grant. May no one vanish unseen again." People left flowers, stuffed animals, cards. One child taped a drawing of a woman holding a baby, with a sun above their heads and the words, "You are not lost." The management left it there. Nobody touched it. And while the media moved on, the family did not. Rachel took custody of all 4 tapes. She had them transferred to digital copies, then locked the originals in a safety deposit box, not for evidence, not for the courts, for memory, for proof. Kevin, once reclusive and silent, started showing up to the vigils again. He didn't speak. He just stood near the edge, a few feet from the stone where her car had been parked, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. Until one day, he looked up. For years, the mystery of Melissa and Jacob had been defined by what was missing, by all. The things never found. But now they had a place, a record, a voice, a name spoken on a tape, and a truth written in dust, plastic, and silence. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a mystery. It had been a choice, someone's calculated, practiced cruelty. But Melissa had left behind just enough. And now, finally, the world had listened.